Oh, então, tudo bem. Okay. So, hello, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming to this conference today on a very and ever more pressing issue in nowadays politics, which is populism. It is, of course, a global phenomenon, but today we are going to focus our attention on the challenges populism presents to the European Union. I have the easy part. For answers, you'll be turning to our two distinguished guests, Vítor Ângelo and José Luís Salles Marques. José Luís Salles Marques is, as most of you, if not all, know, is the president of the Institute of European Studies of Macau, which together with the University of Macau has created the Jean Monnet program, organizing this event and a vast number of interesting initiatives in Macau related to Europe. Vítor Ângelo has a decades-long career in the United Nations, served as representative of the UN Secretary General in several African countries in peacekeeping missions. He is also an associate professor at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He's a specialist in European affairs. Thank you both for coming. Thank you to Fundação Rui Cunha for being our host this evening. And having said this, each one of our guests has a presentation they will share with us. We will start with Mr. José Luís Salles Marques.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to, first of all, thank you, Rui Cunha Foundation, as well as the Jean Monnet program, for having me here today. It is always a pleasure to be in this foundation, which I'm also very proud to be associated to. And I'm also very happy to be with Vítor Ângelo, real specialist, and he is a real specialist. And I'm going to do I play the role of the, those small bands that starts a show of a real superstar. So I will start without further ado. So I'm not going to do any definition or mention any definition of populism, because I think this can be the subject of a further discussion. Just some manifestations of populism in Europe. Of course, I think this slide shows quite well this idea of an island surrounded by all sorts of problems, and particularly the big issue that has been fooling populism, the issue of migration or the refugee crisis, whatever you would like to use the expression to characterize this phenomenon that started happening in Europe, particularly a few years ago. So I have this PowerPoint prepared in Portuguese, but it's easy to understand. We have here the Eurobarometer, and this is opinion about the EU from September 2018. And well, maybe it's a little bit difficult to see what it is, but this is the, let's say, the negative opinion. This is the positive opinion. Excuse me, let me see. Without glasses, a little bit. Okay, so this one is a positive opinion. It's whether Europe is beneficial or not to each one of the persons that took part in the survey. This one is non-beneficial, and this is don't know. So from here we have some curious findings. Of course, this last one is Italy. So the opinion of the let's say, regarding the benefits of Europe is shorter than in any other case of the European member states. This is the average EU. And then there are other examples. For instance, UK is somewhere here. I think it was somewhere here. Okay, UK is here. So this is just a, very, very simple opinion about Europe, whether it is useful or not useful. And from here, we can say that the mapping of populism in Europe do not always coincide with the opinion, whether Europe is beneficial or not to each member state. Okay, so there are other factors that are important to take into account. So it's not so simple as to say, okay, well, yes, these guys in this particular member state, the opinion is that Europe is beneficial, but on the other hand, there are other member states where that opinion is not so positive. So those that are not feel that Europe has not been so positive. So these are the countries or member states where populism is stronger. Well, there is not a clear connection in regard to this issue. Okay, this is another interesting survey that was taken recently, and it's a symbolic vision of Europe. And this symbolic vision of Europe has five different, let's say, images or dimensions. One is regarding order, whether the space is an ordered space, so a place where you feel there's something order and that gives you some kind of comfort. The second one is in regard to interpersonal bond, so whether the space of Europe gives you interpersonal bond. The third one is whether it's a caring society, so let's translate that into simple word, solidarity, where there is solidarity or not. The other one is where there is belongingness, so the sense of belonging to that particular space. And the last one, which is quite important, is whether that space is not ours, but belong to others, the others' world. So in this regard, you can see that this point here, which is the one that refers to the other world, is really the one that comes as the most outstanding, which means that there is a feeling somehow for many people belonging to the countries or the member states where the survey took place that have this feeling that the space of Europe do not belong to them. Okay, so I think this is another item that we have to take into account. So this was a survey which was done to 4 countries, 4 member states. So the UK, we have Italy, and then Greece and Latvia, or Serbia. Estonia, okay. So we can see that the green color, the yellow color refers to the others, okay? So we can see that, for instance, in Greece, the yellow color is quite outstanding. And although in the UK, yes, it's a little bit, but not as much. And very interesting that we see that the sense of belongingness in the UK is not as small as one would expect considering Brexit, okay? But anyway, as I say, these are just information that I'm putting into this conversation that we have so that maybe later we can come to some conclusion. This is the set of countries or member states where populism is stronger. Okay, so for instance, the dark blue color is where they are in the government. This might not be the latest one, but it's very close to what is happening now. And there are several parties that are mentioned here. So I would say that we would have to come back to this map later on. We could have a conversation around that. Okay, so this slide is interesting. Show us the EU states with the highest populist vote share. And we see that Hungary and Greece and Poland and Italy and the Czech Republic, all of them comes very prominently. And of course, we know the reason why. And we know that the populist forces are really much represented in this in the states that I just mentioned. And we come to the point where everybody will ask the question, so in this scenario or in this environment, what kind of scenario can we expect in regard to the coming European Parliament elections in May 2019? Okay, this is a pool. It's so-called the pool of the pools. This is provided by Politico, and I think it's referred to 12 November. So it's a very recent one. And this is what is the current composition of the European Parliament. And we can see that, for instance, EPP will lose quite a lot of seats, but SD, SD will also lose some. No, actually, SD will lose some. And then the Audi will gain a few. But then we can see that the expectations or the projection that we can make from this slide is not a very optimistic, should not give us a very optimistic view in terms of what is going to be the weight of the populists in the coming European Parliament election. This slide is a slide that was provided recently by a professor from the University of Freie University of Berlin, Thomas Reis. And here, And here we have two variables. One, this one here, refers to the people that feel they are national first and European second. Okay, it's increasing. This one is referring to people who feel they are nationals only, okay? So we see that there is an increasing number of people who feel they are nationals and Europeans. However, for the case of European identity, the portion that is, or the group that is more interesting and require a lot of attention is this one, because this one here represents those that feel that they are Europeans. So the European identity, from this point of view, without having into account the national identity, has not really progressed significantly over the years, okay, from 1992 to 2018. So this is one issue, which is, well, after all, after so many years, European identity is still not so relevant as one would expect that to be. Okay. Well, having said that, I have a few points that I'm not going to go into details because I think we would like to share our discussion with Vitor and all of you. But, and this is written in Portuguese, I'm sorry about that. But the thing, maybe the one or 2 points that are really important and would like to underline is that, on one hand, what we have today is is a kind of paralyzes in terms of European governance. We have a decreased level of solidarity and partnership among EU member states. Of course, we have the radical extreme right parties with increased number of votes in the elections. And there is radicalization, political and religious radicalization, as well as the social cohesion is being fragmented. I'm not going to talk about which are the priorities of the EU, but the priorities that EU have been designing and practicing since some time ago is might be one of the reasons why we have, particularly in case of lack of solidarity, social fragmentation or cohesion, and so on. We have a problem there is because there has been alignment to the, let's say, more free market, liberal ideals and practices, and a very restrictive fiscal policy, which is in line with what the Germans want. And therefore, there has been no room for any kind of a more expansionist policy that would eventually solve some of the problems, particularly in terms of, for instance, unemployment, youth unemployment, some need for investment, and so on and so forth. But I will leave this, and I think that we will come back to this later in the discussion. And so this is the introduction that I would like to give to our main actor in this exercise.
Actor.
Thank you very much.
Actor sounds like clown.
Please.
Yes. I will move to that corner. I hope you'll be able to see the slides. If you are there, can you see the slides? Can you see the screen? And is my voice okay with everybody? Yes, it's okay. Well, first, João Pedro Marques, thank you very much for chairing this session. And it's a pleasure to be sharing the floor with Professor Salles Marques. Again, it's a pleasure to be in the foundation, Rui Cunha, and I see Felipe Guadalupe over there. So good to see you. And of course, I'm here again within the framework of the Jean Monnet program. And so I'm very grateful to both the University of Macau and to the Institute de Estudos Europeus that is led by Professor Salles Marques. Yesterday, I talked at the university about the European Union and the future of their relations with China. Today, I was asked to talk about populism, but I will go a little bit beyond that. And I will also talk about defense matters, if you don't mind, just for a few seconds, about migrations, and of course, about one or two issues that were raised by the speaker before, including questions of economic performance and solidarity. So that's my plan. Let me see if I can, yeah. You know these two fellows, I believe. This is Luigi Di Maio, and this is Matteo Salvini. I think it's important that when we start talking about populism in Europe, we bring them together and we have them in front of us. And we have some other people here also that have been quite famous in the recent years as far as populism in Europe is concerned. Marine Le Pen, well-known figure. This is Wilders. Wilders is the key figure as far as populism in the Netherlands is concerned. Petri is no longer in charge of the Alternative for Germany extreme right party, but she was at the beginning of the party, and she's still very influential. And there are many others. We could extend this picture quite a bit. Very recently, there was a survey, a poll, an electoral poll in France, and everybody got very shocked because the results were this. Basically saying that Marine Le Pen's party would get more votes than any other party, including Macron's party. And this came for the French and for many of us in Europe like a wake-up call, when you see all of a sudden that a party that is anti-European, that is extremely populist, that has quite a number of features that are not only extreme right, but are also very close to racist features and so on, to see that party taking the lead when it comes to the French political scene is quite something. And you see Macron, and we could talk about Macron during our discussions because there has been a lot of disappointment about Macron's performance as a president. And as you know, Macron was elected almost 2 years ago, not yet, and there was a lot of hope. And nowadays there is quite a number of questions. There are quite a number of question marks about him. And you see at the top of this, the Socialist Party. This is the party that was in power not long ago. And in this poll, they get 7% of the intentions of the voters. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind because I will come back to that, what's happening to the socialist parties in Europe. This slide is a little bit the continuation of the slide presented by Professor Salles Marques, which is basically a forecast of what could happen with the next parliament in the European Parliament. And one of the main conclusions I will draw from this is the following. You see the list, very long list of parties. And these are groups of parties, families, the far left, the Greens, the Socialists, the Liberals, the center-right, and some other parties. One of the first conclusions we draw from this is that the next parliament will be extremely fragmented. Many parties, many families, very fragmented, which basically means that it will be very difficult to bring together different groups and have some of the most critical decisions approved by a parliament that is going to be very fragmented. Another conclusion that we can draw here is that the Socialist Party, or the Socialist family, to which belongs our own Socialist Party in Portugal, the Socialist Party family, that family will lose the greatest number of seats in Parliament. But also the center-right, and this is the party of Angela Merkel and the family of the party family of Angela Merkel, they will also lose. What does it mean? That both the socialists on the center-left and the center-right, so the center is going to lose quite a number of seats, and extreme parties like these ones here will gain, and this is one of the most extremist parties, and I will come back to that, will gain quite a number of seats, including the far left, they will gain also a number of seats. So this is something that is also creating quite a lot of question marks, raising quite a lot of question marks as far as the next parliament is concerned. A country also, and you have again our fellows here, so Salvini, Matteo Salvini, Luigi Di Maio, and this is their puppet, the Prime Minister of Italy, Conte. Italy is nowadays one of the biggest headaches in terms of the populism in Europe and in terms of the continuation of the European Union as an union. They have very serious problems, and today there is a meeting in Brussels where the Italian budget is going to be discussed, and probably the budget will not be approved by the European Commission, and the procedure of sanctions against Italy will be initiated. This is also an important situation because Italy is one of the biggest economies in Europe, so it's very important what's going on in Italy in terms of the impact over Europe. They have a very high level of public debt, and interestingly, yesterday and the day before, they were trying to raise money in the financial markets, and they were expecting to raise 2.3 billion euros. And this government, these three fellows there, they could only raise 650 million euros instead of 2.3 billion. Basically means that the markets also are looking at this with a very serious, as a very serious matter of concern. The spread of the Italian debt is increasing. When I did this scenario, this slide last week, the spread was 3.0. Yesterday, the spread they had to pay for the money they borrowed was 3.3, so even higher than this. Very close now to the spread that Greece has to pay, and much higher. You see, this is the spread that Portugal is now paying, 1.5. And Italy is now 3.3 if they borrow money. So this is a matter of great concern, and this is very much related with a populist government that is doing a number of things, and actually what they are doing is preparing themselves for two things. For elections next year in Italy, they know that there will be elections, and we will see this man here to be the winner of these elections, meaning the man, the populist on the extreme right, Salvini, be the winner of that elections, and they are taking a number of populist measures, including approving money, allowances, and these kind of things, to be able to win those elections, and particularly this man. And they will also, and particularly also this one, this is a key player nowadays also in the European scene. This man is also trying to get his political family to obtain as many seats as possible in the European Parliament. So this is a very, very serious matter of concern for all of us. Another fellow that is also extremely dangerous, oh sorry, what happened to my, is this one, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. This is in many ways as dangerous as the other fellows that I mentioned in the slide before. And one of the reasons why he's very dangerous is because he is within the mainstream. The other guys are at the margins. They do not belong to the key families, political families of the European scene. This one belongs to the center-right family, to the same family to which belongs Angela Merkel, for instance. And that's very, very important because we have a major populist acting within the largest political family in Europe. And interestingly, the Chinese organized on that date, on the 9th of November, so a few days ago, a meeting with him that is sponsored in Budapest and gave him quite a lot of leverage. And this was also seen, and I'm not going to read this, but this was also seen by the European leaders as something that is a matter of worry, a matter of concern. The kind of support that he's getting from outside, including the fact that he wants to be seen as the key interlocutor between the European Union and the Chinese government. And he is one of the key promoters of this initiative, which is, one is China, and the other one, 16, is the 16 countries that you have here on this box. And this is a very important issue for us because in many ways it's seen not only as a way of promoting a critical, a very key populist, but is also seen as a way of dividing the European Union at a time when anything that divides the European Union is perceived as negative. So I think it's important that we keep this in mind as well. So what is populist and what is the populist agenda? I have tried to summarize it over there. Basically, is an agenda that is based on nationalism, on saying no to globalism and to Brussels, to the European institutions. Is an agenda that divides the population into two. One side, the people, these are the good ones, and the other side, the professional politicians, those are the bad ones. And the populists is to give a voice to the people against the professional politicians, against what I call here the old order. And particularly, they take advantage of the fact that many of these politicians have been in power for many, many years. And they say, well, you see, these guys can only do politics. They don't know anything else. And not only that, it's a corrupt class. So corruption is also a very important word in the populist discourse. It's an agenda that is anti-austerity, anti-immigration, and interestingly, is also against the big banks, against the financial system, against the financiers. And this is an important thing because even the guys at the extreme right, they have this kind of discourse. Because this is the kind of discourse that people at the grassroots level like to hear. And these are the messages that they're putting across, the populists. Interestingly, they don't make any difference between right and left. They try to fish in all kinds of waters. They try to fish votes from the left and votes from the right. And they have been successful. They challenge, therefore, the old political divide. It's transversal. There is no longer right and left. It's the political spectrum, and they talk to both sides of the political spectrum. However, it's basically a conservative agenda with very extreme proposals. So we cannot ignore that, above all, the agenda is conservative. And one of the main or the strong points of the populists is that they propose very simple, one-aligned solutions to very complex problems. It's like that fellow, I don't remember his name, that says, we will solve the immigration problem if we build a wall. I think somebody said that. So a very complex problem is simply resolved by saying, we build a wall and the problem is sorted out. And these are the kind of proposals that people on the street, people on the platforms, on the social platforms, understand very well. Some people say it's a little bit like the old demagogues, is manipulation of the opinion, but I think it's much more than that, because the old demagogues would not do this. They would not go across the political divide. They would be demagogues from the left or demagogues from the right, but not fishing both on the left and on the right. There are many movements in Europe. Nowadays, the figures are basically the following. Out of the 28 European countries, in 11 countries, there are populists in coalition in government. Not just in Italy, not just in Norway, or not just in Finland, or not just in Hungary, but in 11 countries. Actually, it's more or less estimated, in one example also is Austria. It's also estimated that between 20 to 25% of the voters nowadays vote for populist movements in Europe, which is quite a bit of voters. 20% is one voter in 5, but 25% is one voter in every 4 voters. So that's an important thing. Some of them have clearly neo-Nazi and racist roots, and they are very much at the radical end side of the spectrum. issues of identity and nationality are critical in their discourse. There is also a populism at the extreme left, and basically is a modern version of anti-capitalist radicalism combined with some political naivety, I would say. And some people try to put the Eurosceptics also within the populist pool. I think we have to be a little more careful. You can be Eurosceptic and not be a populist. And I think we can have a look at that as well. So what is the narrative? And I have tried to summarize the narrative of the populists in 3 main boxes. The first thing they say is that Brussels is devil. Brussels is bureaucratic, is inefficient, and they are not concerned with our own problems. The second part of their narrative is that our own national sovereignty is not being respected. That's the second element of the narrative. And the third element is this one, that our identity, be it our national identity as Italians, as Austrians, as whatever, as French, or as Europeans, is being undermined, particularly by the arrival of people coming from other cultures. So these are the 3 main building blocks of the populist narrative. And now I put this off. Brexit 2016 was in many ways an example of populism, and I'm not going to go into that, but the messages that were put across, and I very much remember some of those messages, were so untrue, but so popular in terms of trying to convince people. So it was plenty of simplifications, of simplistic views, and also plenty of disinformation, because disinformation is one of the tools that the populists make use of. So this is a bit about the populism. Now a little bit about defense. There has been this discussion about an European army. You know Macron's position. He's very much in favor. You know also Donald Trump's reaction to that position. I put here, "Niet," no European army. Then Merkel came in support of Macron recently. The British are very much against it, and they keep saying it every day, including all the top military officers from the British Army. They say, at any occasion, every time they go to a public function, etc., they have been told, you clearly state that the European army is nonsense. The idea of a European army is nonsense. Europeans will be defended by NATO, not by an European army. That's the line as far as the British are concerned. And interestingly, one of the individuals that came very much in support of the idea of an European army is our old friend, Vladimir. Vladimir Putin says, oh yes, Macron's suggestion is a very good one. Why did he say that? Because he knows that that position, that Macron's position, can, if it goes ahead, undermine the unity within NATO. And that's his main objective, is to make sure that NATO is as much undermined as possible. So that's a little bit on the army. I will say 1, 2 more things on the army, because there are many misunderstandings about that. One of the misunderstandings is about the money that is spent. Nowadays, the European member states spend around 200 billion euros every year on defense. That's quite a bit of money. It's not as much money as the Americans. The Americans spend over 550 billion euros equivalent on defense, but it's more than the Chinese spend. Of that money, 25% of it is spent only by the United Kingdom, and then France, Germany, Italy, and Spain are the other countries. if the European countries were to spend 2%, you see the 2% there, of GDP on defense, as it was agreed at the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, they should not spend 200 billion, they should spend 300 billion. So this is the gap that Mr. Trump keeps talking about. But, there is a but to this. The European defense has many, many inefficiencies, and has in the recent years also gained some ground and addressed some of these inefficiencies, but they are still there. One of them is that the European armies are very fragmented. Each country has its own army, and very often it's very difficult to bring them together and make them operational together. So there is poor interoperability between the different armies. There is a lot of duplication in terms of expenditures. Countries keep spending the same kind of monies for the same kind of activities, equipment, training, and so on and so forth, when that could be done together. But the main problem for me, the two main problems, one is this one. There is no adequate response to the new threats that Europe is facing. We're still looking at the armed forces of Europe with the old eyes. We still believe that if there is an attack against Europe, if there is any problem in terms of defense, it will be like it was in 1939-45. The world has changed, and the threats are completely different, and there is no real agreement between the European countries about what are the main threats and how to respond to these threats, with the exception of one or two threats, like the cyber security threat. There is agreement on that, and there has been quite a lot of progress, actually, recently, on bringing together resources on cyber security defense. There is some agreement on Russia, but not total agreement, because some countries, including, for instance, Hungary, some countries feel that Russia is not a threat, and the threat is elsewhere. And then there is a major disconnect between one of the most important threats recognized by the security specialists and by the population, which is terrorism, and trying to address terrorism with an army. Terrorism is addressed basically with intelligence services and with police services, not with armed forces. So that's something also that has, and the role of the armed forces in the fighting against terrorism, I'm talking about domestic European-grown terrorism, is something that needs to be dealt with very carefully. Another thing, another very weak point in terms of the defense of Europe is that our political leaders are providing almost no guidance to the military chiefs. So the military chiefs do their own agenda, and they get very little guidance from the political leaders. That has been also the case in Portugal, for those of you who are interested in Portugal. In the last 20 years, we had seen in the Ministry of Defense of Portugal a succession of extremely weak defense ministers that could provide no guidance, no frame of reference to our armed forces. And that's why we have nowadays a very serious disconnect in Portugal between what's going on in the armed forces and the Ministry of Defense. But we can talk about that if you are interested. Europe, in terms of defense, is also looking at some new realities, and with big eyes. You see the big eyes of Europe there. And we are a little bit surprised by a number of things. We are surprised by Trump, of course. Who is not surprised by Trump? We are also raising quite a very big number of question marks about this man and what he intends to do, Erdogan. I have to tell you that quite a number of people in Europe are very concerned about the fact that Turkey is still one of the key members of this organization at a time when Erdogan is going in a completely different direction. And then there is the debate about what is the level of international insecurity and how does Europe respond to an increased international insecurity? So these are some of the issues on defense. We are also looking at, particularly recently with the celebrations on the First World War, we are looking at some lessons from the past. One is that peace is always fragile. Then the second lesson is that the fact that there is trade and commerce between countries, that does not prevent countries from getting into war. The third one, and that's why we talk about an European army, is that if we go for a political union, we have to have a common defense. And if we have to have a common defense, we have to have a much more integrated armed forces in Europe. And third, and last point, if the international order collapses, the consequences will be far worse than almost anyone imagines, and we can spend quite a bit of time discussing that. But the United States, they are saying that they are moving away from Europe. This is the number of soldiers they have nowadays in Europe. This is the number of bases. This number has increased during Donald Trump's presidency, notwithstanding his official discourse. In 2016, the United States spent that amount of money, close to 800 million dollars with the armed forces, the American armed forces in Europe. This year is spending this amount, 4.7 billion US dollars. So a serious increase of the American presence, the American military presence in Europe, notwithstanding what is publicly said. And there are some elements here where they are spending their money. You can read that when you have time to go through these slides. But some of these things have a lot to do with this increased intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Military presence overseas of the Americans. And you see that Germany is the second one after Japan. Japan is where they have the largest contingent, and then Germany. This idea of an European army is an old idea. This is Joschka Fischer. He was a very important foreign minister of Germany 20 years ago. And he was already saying at that time, loud and clear, that the European Union needs one army, one constitution, and one foreign policy. We are going in the direction of having indeed a common foreign policy. We are not yet moving in the area of constitution, but we are now talking gradually and more about one common defense approach. And by the way, the last few days, 17 new projects to bring together the different armed forces of Europe have been approved, and that's a beginning. So there is some movement beyond the words. Immigration is also an important issue nowadays, and that the populists have been very good at taking advantage of. Unfortunately, there is no common position on how to deal with immigration. So each country has been dealing with it as they can. And that has allowed the populists, particularly in Italy, to move up and gain support, because basically they're saying, you see, Brussels is not helping us, Europe is not helping us, and we are receiving all these people from Africa. So this is a major issue that is unresolved and needs to be resolved quickly if we want to cut out of the populist agenda one major issue that is giving them votes. And I wanted to end with a note of positive note. So quite a number of Europeans believe that their country has benefited, as you said, Delwish, from being members of the European Union. They consider that the European Union membership of the European Union is a good thing. There is optimism for the first time again after many years. There is optimism about the future of the European Union. And interestingly, when people are asked what are the main issues that they would like the European Union to resolve, The first one is terrorism. Remains an important issue. Youth and employment, and then immigration is over there. Another one, and this is, I think, the last one. Globalization. Quite a number of Europeans still believe that open markets and globalization is an important thing. Only 21% of the Europeans disagree, and very many of these 21% vote populist. On migration, quite a number also think that migration is important for their countries. And interestingly, and that's very worrisome, quite a bit, about half of the population of Europe has insufficient skills to participate in digital economy and society. Or that means what? That they feel threatened by the future. And as they feel threatened by the future, the populists go there and fish votes out of this. A slide on fake news. I think it's also important when we talk about populists, we talk about fake news. Interestingly, radio is still high in terms of the trust. TV, and that's why it is important that the quality of what is said on TV is of high quality, because people believe on TV, then online and the social networks. But this is, I find it an important slide. We had a lot of hope on this man, Emmanuel Macron. He is going not in the right direction in terms of popular support. He has too many problems within France. He has not been able to play the European role that we wanted him to play. I put here in French basically something that he said a few days ago when he realized that his popularity was going down. So he said that he has to look at the way he looks at people, how he considers people, the way France and Europe protects people, and bringing solutions to the problems of people. The interesting thing is also the word protect, because one of the things we have to make sure is that in our messages about populism and so on in Europe, we talk about Europe that protects. This is the cover of The Spectator recently with our friend Matteo Salvini over there and Macron. A little bit like as if the dispute was between these two men in Europe. It's much more complex than this. And I think we should not reduce the European scene and European discussions on a fight between these two fellows, particularly because this one here, Macron, is having a very serious problem of image because he's being, by these people, associated with two things that the European people don't like. One, he says that he is elite. He comes from elite schools. He has an elite education. He worked in the best banks before being a minister. So he's the elite that does not understand and is disconnected from the people. So that's one of the things that is being said about him, including by Salvini. And the second thing that is said about him is that he does not belong to the center-left or the center-right. He belongs to the liberal movement. And the word liberal, and you talked about it, is a word in Europe nowadays that does not bring votes. If you say that this man is a liberal, means basically don't vote for him if you are from the people. And that's me.
Thank you. Well, thank you to both speakers for your interesting presentations. Before going back to populism, I would like to pick up something you said in your presentation about the European army. It's something that's high on the agenda these days. Okay. And I would like to ask you, how do you feel about the timing of this proposal, if you will? Because nowadays, one of the things that populism is doing is challenging the very European idea, if you will. So this proposal of an European army is not new, but it's now being put forward again by Mr. Macron, also Angela Merkel. Do you think it's a good timing because the European project is not in shape, so to speak? Or do you think it's a bad timing because of that? Should it be a cause for European unity or the consequence of European unity? How do you feel about the timing of this proposal?
Well, I'm trying to put myself first in the shoes of President Macron, and basically trying to understand why he raised the issue of the European army at this stage. For 2 or 3 reasons. One of the reasons is to show to the Europeans, to the French first and then to the Europeans, that he has a different agenda when compared with Donald Trump. And therefore that he can propose something that will not please the Americans and something that will make the difference between the Europeans and the Americans. So in many ways it was an affirmation of authority vis-à-vis the President of the United States. The second thing is that the President of France raised the issue of the European army because he needs to find 1 or 2 or 3 banners that could bring the Europeans together. And that could be one of the banners if he is able to relate it to some of the key fears that the Europeans have, particularly the one on terrorism. So he hopes to gain some support, some popular support, some voter support, because he's trying to address one of the key fears. And the third one is that this is about European army is very much associated with European sovereignty. And for many Europeans, to talk about European sovereignty is an important thing because they feel that Brussels and that the European leaders have not been good enough at defending and fighting for the European sovereignty. So these are some of the reasons. Is it the right time or not? Time will say. We don't know. I told you what are the reasons he has, and I also told you that a number of new projects have been approved to bring together some of the industrial matters that deal with the armed forces. To bring together, for instance, one of the new projects is to build a new type of armored infantry vehicle that will be used by all the European forces. Another thing that will be also put together is the intelligence dimension and some kind of training in terms of having the same standards in terms of collecting and analyzing information. So there are a number of things that are already being done. I have to say that I have been following European defense matters for the last 8 or 9 years. 8 or 9 years ago, in particular when it was the Libya crisis, the European armies were extremely fragmented, as I mentioned. And not only that, they have very serious difficulties in some critical areas. For instance, they had no capacity to fuel airplanes. If the airplanes were going to attack Libya, there was no capacity in terms of planes, tankers, to fuel those airplanes, and therefore they had to count on the American side. They had no capacity at that time to identify the right targets. And they had to count on the Americans for target identification, which is the most critical issue when you are conducting this kind of operations. Some of these issues in the last few years have been put on the table and are beginning to be addressed. So there is some progress in terms of the European armed forces, but there are also some serious rivalries. One, and some serious question marks. One of the question marks I mentioned is that the British, which are certainly the strongest armed forces in Europe, are not ready to play the European card when it comes to defense because they think that it should be played within NATO. The second reason is because there is serious competition between the armed forces of Germany and Poland, And this is a very important issue because the Poles do not want to see an European army that is led by Germans. And therefore, the Poles say yes to European army integration, but act negatively when it comes to implement it, because they prefer to stay within the American umbrella. So there are a number of contradictions, but this is the way you construct the future, is moving the agenda, trying to build a number of projects and see if they can move forward.
I believe there's something you would like to add on this.
Well, I'd like to make some comments in regard to this particular issue. First of all, I think that the fact, and of course I agree with most of what Victor has said about this topic, but the fact that we are talking about the European army as a unifying factor tells a lot about the political spectrum in Europe nowadays, which is the political spectrum of Europe is relying on the Eurocentric right sector of the spectrum as the last frontier, in a way, as the frontier where beyond that we will have, let's say, the extreme right and so on and so forth. So nowadays, bandwagoning around European center-right tells us, of course, Eurocentric right in Europe tells us a lot about what is going on in terms of development of the political spectrum in Europe. The second one is, as we've seen, and of course, this is the result of the big losses that were incurred by the left in most of Europe. Of course, Portugal is still the little asterisk village in Europe in regard to the left. It's a little bit like the resistance point. But the thing is, the left has lost a lot because the left has a contradiction, which is on one hand, it has to defend European values, which were very much built with a discourse around solidarity and social model and so on and so forth. And if you go to China, the Chinese want to know about the social model of Europe. They don't want to know about the liberal politics of Europe because they know how to do better than that. So the thing is, we are talking about a big issue here, because when we don't talk about the problems that normal people have and how to solve them, we are not going to change this kind of trend. We are not going to introduce new policies that will eventually improve the case of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and other issues that are around economic development, sustainable development, as well as balanced development that will go to everybody. Because as you see, you show also in one of your slides, the big concern about the income inequality, increase in income inequality. And all of this has one particular name, and we should always be able to point out that, which is the kind of liberal policies that were somehow they are inspiring European elites, or most of the European governments from, let's say, late 1990s up to now. So I think this is a big issue, and it's an issue that many people, including in Germany, I remember seeing several research projects, as well as prominent people such as Habermas, talking about the need to change this kind of setting in terms of economic policy and the priorities that should be given by the EU. On the other hand, I think there is also many issues that has to be recognized in terms of some, for instance, when we talk about European army, there is another which I am not against that, although I think probably the timing has to do with the elections as well. But I think one of the issues that we have to recognize is that also the failure of some slogans that were pointed out as main, very important, let's say, topics or policies or positions of the EU, namely the issue of Europe's civilian power. That was very much a very strong idea that used to be put forward. So Europe is a civilian power. And so all the European economies, as well as governments, they build their budgets and around that idea that Europe was a civilian power. So nowadays, when we talk about European army, one must question, so where the money comes from to build a European army, where the money comes from. That is one big issue. And last but not least, I think that the issue of security, of course, is always very, very central to everyone. I mean, if we go, particularly if we follow this realistic approach to international relations, the survival is a key issue. However, I think we need to look also, and there are, of course, threats within Europe, namely from Russia, something that 20 years ago was not there, at least not recognizable as such, even 10 years ago. But then nowadays we have this kind of problem. But on the other hand, we have new issues, and then those issues have to do with what you mentioned also, with the need to improve maybe the intelligence, and also look at the problems of the fake news, because we see that, and there are some recent information in regard to that for instance, Cambridge Analytica, who play a role in the election of Donald Trump, play a role in Brexit, and also, besides that, I think that nowadays, even in Portugal, there are already some blogs selling or putting some fake news about Portuguese politicians. So this is something that is happening everywhere. And maybe this is the reason why, coming back to Habermas, he used a very interesting sentence, which is the international far-right. Many years ago, we used to have the Communist International, and now maybe we have a far-right international. This is it.
Thank you. Vitor Angelo, why should we worry about populism? Because at the end of the day, it's happening within the democratic framework. It's what people want. Some countries want. It's not revolutionary in that point of from that point of view. People are choosing these leaders. So it is, of course, a challenge to the European project. But what if that's what people want?
That's quite a question. Well, I think we should worry about populism, and particularly with the extreme right populism. And one of the reasons is that these populist movements are ultra-nationalists, and they are racist. Some Portuguese racists recently, when there were these manifestations, these rallies in Chemnitz, in Germany, they thought, well, these rallies in Chemnitz are against Muslims and the Muslim immigration population that is in Germany. And I told several of them that I could talk to or write to, if you go there with your look like a Portuguese and you look like a Portuguese, you will be put in the same bag as the Islamists that they are chasing, and you'll be attacked as well. So there is a very strong element of racism in this. And racism and ultra-nationalism have been two of the main sources of war and serious conflict in Europe. So I think just for those reasons, we should be very worried about it. These guys are extremely, extremely racist, and racism can lead to major problems within the European context. As I mentioned in one of the slides, there has been peace in Europe for the last 73 or 74 years, but you should never take peace for granted. So we could go back to a situation of serious conflict within the European frontiers and within the European borders. I live in a country, I live in Belgium nowadays. I live in a country that is very small. And there are two main populations there. One of Germanic roots, the Flemish, and others with more Latin roots, the Walloons. The hatred that is there within the country between these two communities is much bigger than what we think. And this is within the same national boundary. We, the Europeans, have been, in the past, quite brutal among ourselves. And anything that increases the division and increases the racism among ourselves should be looked at with a lot of concern. That's why.
Is there anything you would like to add? And I would like to, on top of that, also ask, is there a distinction to be made, I think so, between nationalism and populism?
Well, I think there is some distinction to be made. Not all nationalists are populists. Populism, I think, is...
I'm referring, of course, to what's happening in Europe.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think in Europe they come very much together. But the main thing about the populism is actually this ability that they have to somehow pretend that they speak on behalf of the people. If everybody would be thinking the same, and they are let's say, the most legitimate or whatever representative of this anonymous group of that they call the people, right? And so, Vitor mentioned already the kind of discourse that they have. It's very easy to say, okay, let's build a bridge or put some guards on the, on the beach, or just prevent the people from crossing the Mediterranean or something like that. It's a propaganda, and the problem is whether you have an audience or not willing to listen to that kind of propaganda, and that thing is not created by populism, by populists. Populists make use or take the opportunity to have this kind of audience of people who wants somehow or are, for some reason, they are willing to listen to them and to follow their ideas. But this group of people were not created by populists. This comes from the process of somehow for many different reasons, but mostly I would say that on one hand I come back to the issue of the policies of the EU, the way the EU tackled the 2008 crisis, with the kind of policies that were used, the fundamentalist, monetarist policies that were used, and also, of course, issues such as identity issues, the problem of integration or disintegration or no integration of parts of the population, the problems that has to do with inequalities, with so many issues that were supposed to be resolved with policies of cohesion, for instance, and they were not. And so this is the ground where they put their seed, the populists put their seed to grow whatever they want to grow, okay? So I think we need to look at this from a very comprehensive and complex point of view. This cannot be solved only by, okay, if, let's suppose that the populists, we can stop the populists to do their propaganda or something like that. Will that change? Well, if today maybe it's this one, tomorrow might be the fundamentalist or religious fundamentalism or whatever at the same time. So we are looking at the problems, the social and economic problems that the population in Europe, in the EU has. Of course, each country, each region is different, but we have to look and solve this kind of problem.
So the problem might be that Europe is not actually delivering what has been promising, and people hope the individual states to better solve their problems. Do you think that's the case? And you made an interesting list of several causes that explain populism these days. If you had to choose one single major cause for this wave of populism in 2018, which one would it be? Like the way the financial crisis was dealt with? Would it be that one?
Well, he's trying to make me a populist, because when you only choose one cause, you are a populist, because it's a very complex.
There are several causes, but there are more important causes than others.
There are several causes, and I think you have mentioned quite a number of them. Let me take an example that we do not talk about very often, which is the Czech Republic. Not many people know what's going on in the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is, from the identity point of view, is very unified. Everybody's Czech, or more or less everybody's Czech. From the economic point of view, is one of the countries in Europe that is growing the fastest, growing very fast. The unemployment rate in the Czech Republic is 3.2, 3.3%, which is almost non-existent. However, it's a country with a populist government. Why? Where did they find the votes, and how could they convince people to vote for them? They created two false problems. One was that the migrants that had come to Germany would be expelled, part of them, to the Czech Republic. So they were going to be invaded by migrants. So immigration is one of the key elements that the populists love to exploit. And the second element was basically the following. Brussels doesn't care about us. And very often Brussels is also used as a tool, attacking Brussels is used as a tool for the populists. Brussels is not considering us, is not paying attention to us, and is not paying attention to Eastern Europe. And that's where the divide, and this is an important divide nowadays in Europe, that's where the divide between Western and Eastern Europe started. And it started in the Czech Republic, and it was then immediately picked by the Poles in Warsaw, and further down the line by other people from the eastern side.
But are they right
Hungary,
thinking so?
There were some difficulties between Brussels and some Eastern European countries. Certainly there were serious discussions between Brussels and Romania and Bulgaria, because in both countries the governments were extremely corrupt. And this was very much on the agenda in the discussions between the center and those two countries. But this was presented by the populists. It's not because they are corrupt, it's because they are from Eastern Europe. Then the question also of Poland. Poland is a very, I don't know if you know Poland very well, but it's a very special case as well. And Poland, gradually, the Law and Justice Party became, it was not a populist party, and became gradually a populist party, building on the Polish identity, which is for the Poles a very important thing. Poland, 100 years ago, was divided in three countries. There was no Poland. Part of Poland was belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But let me say that they just celebrated their 1,050-year-old independence, so they feel themselves very old.
As people,
Yeah.
but not as a nation, not as a country, which is different. Okay. So they were very divided. And so this feeling of being Pole and the Polish national feeling was explored and exploited by the Law and Order party. And one of the things they did was not only to explore that, but then to start controlling the media and to start controlling the legal system. And then Brussels attacked them and told them that's not possible. And again, the Czechs and the Poles and the Hungarians and so on said, you see, these guys in Brussels are only concerned with what's going on in the eastern part of Europe. So there is also this divide, which is a very important divide, because in the past, up to recently, there was a divide in Europe between the North and the South. The guys from the North were the virtuous ones, and the guys from the South were the ones spending money with wine and other things. I don't want to mention them. That divide is now less important, but there is this divide between the East and the West, and this is used by the populists in the East to gain votes and to show that they are very much against Brussels and for their national interests. Actually, one of the things we didn't mention this, but one of the things that the populists always say is that we are moralists. We fight for moral principles. And one of the moral principles they fight for is, for instance, against these guys in Brussels and so on and so forth that want to impose on us values that do not belong to our culture. And one of the examples is very much all the examples about the new approach to marriage, for instance. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, okay. You talked about the moral issue. Also, on the other side, there tends to be sometimes a moral superiority tone to the discussion, meaning the cosmopolitan, enlightened elites look down on the populists. Do you think that creates also a gap between the two sides and makes it harder to actually come to an agreement, to a way forward?
Yeah, well, I think there are some different traditions. We are talking about cultures, we are talking about political cultures as well. And I remember that I visited Poland 2004, the Czech Republic, and Hungary 2005. And actually, IEM was the organization in Macau that promotes, the first one to promote the new members. We organized something, I don't remember, some of the people from the press, if they still remember, a session at the military club to bring the newcomers, to present them to the society in a way. So that was a very interesting process, But I always had the feeling, from the very, very beginning, that it was not a very well, let's say, completed process, because for some reason there was this maybe geopolitical issue of and the pressure from the United States, right, from them to join the EU as soon as possible, and that principle, that idea of the acquis communautaire, okay, I think was never really swallowed by those new member states. I remember talking with someone, a very prominent director or head of the economic department of the university in Budapest that used to be called Karl Marx University, now has a different name. Yes, I don't know which one. I cannot remember the name. And he told me something so clearly, you know. So he said that the only reason why they were entering the EU was really to, you know, to protect their own interests. And maybe the Magyars, right? They were in Albania or something like that. So he looked at that from a very, very narrow interest viewpoint, very, very centric viewpoint. So there's nothing about the EU and the values and you know, building a European let's say a common house or something like that. These kind of things that you say nice narrative that you say to people, particularly people that come from far away, right, from Asia. But he was very, very, you know, very, very straightforward in saying that, okay, the one reason is because this is coming, you know, giving us something to play with, or to maybe some investment, something like that, you know, the EU funds and things like that. And in Poland, I saw something written in the newspaper, and that thing I will never forget about that, because it was saying, and it was Polish. It was a Polish newspaper. That Poland is more American than the United States of America.
Go on.
Yeah, I think we were not very clear about one thing: the socialist parties and the socialist family. And I think we should mention something about that. If you allow me to say that. The Socialist Party and the socialist parties in general and the center-right parties became like Thompson and Thompson in the Tintin story. You remember Dupont and Dupont, meaning there was almost no difference with time between the politics proposed by the center-right and the politics proposed by the center-left. And the fact of the matter is, because of this lack of clarity, particularly on the socialist side, they lost a lot of support. And many of those who used to vote socialist, including many of those who used to vote communist, but many of those who used to vote socialist, were fished out and were taken by the populists. And they are now voting populist. And we sometimes forget that one of the explanations for the increased support for the populism is because the socialists have lost a lot of ground.
Right. I think it's time to open up the session for questions from the public. Anyone wants to ask a question? I believe there should be a microphone somewhere. Yep.
Mario.
Estava à procura do microfone. Está aqui. Okay.
Thank you. I will try to explain my idea about this matter, but first of all, I'm against the European Army. I'm against Mr. Macron. I think Mr. Macron politically is not mature. And after that, the main question is civil security, not army security. The problem of the countries is to be safe, to trust the governments, to trust the daily life, and not a question of of war. First, after that, I think the solution until now, with the NATO taking care of the big questions about war, is the best solution until now and must go on until new developments. Well, after this, I would like to perhaps inform people about this. And I read, 190 states have negotiated the UN's Global Compact for Migration. Mm-hmm. However, 2 months before it is signed, Austria is expressing its concerns. The USA and Hungary have already announced they will not sign this agreement. And this agreement must be signed next month in Marrakesh. So, as you see, the question of the migration is starting quite in a good shape. I would like my friend Vitor Angelo tell me your opinion about this global, they call the Global Compact for Migration. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, before I go into that, I should, because you said you do not agree with the European Army. You belong to the same club I belong to. I think the investment has to be on the NATO side of things, and we should keep investing and trying to get NATO and European participation in the NATO as strong as possible. And there I agree with you. I have also to say that one of the reasons why I do not agree with the European Army is that most of the public opinion is not prepared. In Europe, most of the public opinion is not prepared to spend more money on armed forces. The military budgets are very difficult to sell. Very difficult.
But they will increase anyway.
They will increase, but not as much as it will be required. They will increase. There will be some pressure to increase, but to really build an European army is not the 300 billion euros that I mentioned. Is much more that would be necessary during several years to bring together all these things. There will be segments that will be together, some interventions and some equipment and some training can be done together, but the overall umbrella that is NATO is there to stay. And we have seen actually that the Americans themselves understand that, and that's why they are investing more and more on NATO and more on the European, on their European presence. So the question of the European army is certainly a very important political issue. It's important to talk about it. It's important to bring together as many resources as possible, but it will be very difficult to build a real European army that is able to compete with, for instance, the Russian army, for instance, just to give you an example, or that will not require any kind of major support from the American side. The other thing also, and I think I mentioned that very, very briefly, is when it comes to European security, what needs to be done is much more integration of the intelligence services and of the police services in Europe. And that's an area where we have to invest more, and we have to be much better at doing that. There has been some progress. Nowadays, the exchange of information is much better than it was 3 or 4 years ago between the police of the different states, but it's not yet enough, and much more needs to be done, and much more needs to be done in terms of risk analysis. We are not very good at understanding what are the potential risks, and we are not very good at understanding what are the main domestic threats to our own security. We still associate that with one segment of the population that is of Muslim origin, or one segment of the population that has this kind of religion, or someone, or this kind of ethnic origin, but that's not enough. There is a need to much better understand what's going on. And the fact of the matter is that we do not have the full picture and the full information about the risks, and we don't have enough capacity about how to analyze the risks. Even in the case of major terrorist threats, we are always caught by surprise. So that's what I would say about that. On the migration side, you mentioned the compact. The compact that has been approved and is going to be signed by most countries in Marrakesh next month is a framework, is a guideline, is not international law, is not of mandatory application or implementation. It's just to clearly spell out what is expected from the states in case of major migratory flows. So it's a frame of reference, and as a frame of reference, I think it should be approved and signed by every country, because every country after that can implement it, take into consideration their own national circumstances. But the fact of the matter is that within the European context, there are 3 or 4 countries that will not sign that compact, and we feel that that's very unfortunate and undermines not only the values of the European Union, but also undermines the unity of the European Union. And those countries are, as you mentioned, Austria first, Hungary, Poland probably will not sign that compact. And up to last week, there were serious doubts if Belgium would sign or not, because one of the parties that is in the coalition government in Belgium is an extreme nationalist and racist party linked to the Flemish minority, and that party didn't want the government to sign, and they have threatened to leave the coalition if the Prime Minister signs the compact. And the Prime Minister has just said 2 days ago or yesterday that he has decided to go to Marrakesh and to sign the compact. So he has, in many ways, taken a very brave position. But this is a very serious problem, and again, shows that migration and immigration in general is one of the key banners, one of the key flags that the populists and the extremists of the right agitate, particularly in the European context.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Is it working? One can find answers perhaps to understand the rise of populism in certain countries like Italy because of migration, or perhaps Eastern Europe because of they have this sense of identity and they are quite nationalist. But how would you explain the rise of nationalism in Northern Europe, for instance, in Scandinavia, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, in Sweden, for instance, which came as a surprise that so rapidly the party that is not only extreme right, but is of Nazi inspiration, has been able to get so many votes in the last elections. Again, is the fact that important segments of the Swedish population are not of Swedish roots. So these are people that came to Sweden, or their parents came to Sweden, coming from Somalia, coming from the Middle East, or other parts of the world. They look very different. And one of the things that the racists immediately do in Sweden, in Northern Europe, or in any other parts of Europe, is to look at your eyes and see the color of your eyes, the shape of your eyes, the nose, your nose, what kind of nose you have, and so on and so forth. Meaning, basically, they are always putting you in a catalog. And that's the way the racists and the way the extremists work. And in a country like Sweden, or in a country like Finland, where everybody else is blonde and has blue eyes or green eyes, all of a sudden, if you are a little bit darker, if you are a little bit different, you are immediately seen as not belonging. And so that's why one of the reasons. And the fact of the matter is that many of these people, because they are not fully integrated, and we have not talked about that, but we should talk about that. One of the things that have failed during the past few years in Europe is the integration of the immigrants. We have not been able to integrate people. It's not just that they look different, but also they do not speak the language as well as they should be speaking. They have not gone through the education system as they should have gone. And in many ways, there has been no assimilation of the values that they should have assimilated. So the integration issue is also an important one. Look at me. You look at me, and I tell you a story. Some years ago, I was going to a small village in the south of Brussels. Very local village where everybody is from the village. And I stopped my car, and I have actually quite a visible car. I stopped my car and got out of the car, and there was a small group of individuals there, and I asked them, where is the municipality? Because I wanted to go to the municipal house, to the city hall, to the local hall. And one of the guys looked at me and looked at my face, and he made a joke, and he said the following: "Oh, you're looking for the town hall? I thought you were looking for the mosque." You see? And this is with my aspect. So imagine somebody that is even darker, that looks even more from elsewhere, and so on and so forth. And this is the discrimination you find, and this is the kind of hints you get all the time in many places. And these people, most likely, they vote at that time, well, 3 or 4 years ago, they were voting center-right or even center-left. But certainly, if tomorrow something goes wrong and there is a populist that comes to that village and talks to them, they will be ready to vote populist. So that's the Europe we have. And we have the same problems in many other parts of Europe. I mean, some of you might know Portugal well. Normally I spend part of summer in Estremoz. You know Estremoz, some of you might know Estremoz in Alentejo. And Estremoz has, in one of the corners of the small town, a very strong gypsy presence. And I can tell you that and they are Portuguese like all of them, all the others, and myself, but they are discriminated. And every time the gypsies come to the supermarket, or every time the gypsies come somewhere, you can see immediately that in the supermarket, all the guards in the supermarket are mobilized to watch them, and so on and so forth. So you see this kind of problems everywhere. It's not translated into political terms, and is not giving origin to any kind of populist movement against the gypsies. But one of the things I have learned is that we in Europe, in Portugal, in Sweden, or in the northern countries, or elsewhere, we tend, deep inside, we tend to be racists. And it's very easy to explore and exploit that.
Maybe one last question before we go.
Okay. So if I may assume that Brexit was the cause of populism or nationalism's rise in Britain, what can we forecast for the future of the EU? As in, do you think that this will encourage more countries to leave the EU in pursuit of national or populist interests, or do you think they will pursue their populist or national interests for the European nation as a whole?
Well, maybe I'll try to give you an answer, but of course, Victor, I'm sure will be saying something else. But I think that as Brexit is developing, it actually help, you know, the majority, at least, of people in Europe, including some people who were having talks of walking out, to reconsider that again. Because I think that notwithstanding the importance of nationalism and populism, people look at their own interests and their own lifestyle and their own job and their own business. And Brexit is not good for business. I think Brexit, in the way it has developed, I think there are some pools about that, right? Help to, in a certain way, to increase or to the idea that EU is something that is useful. The European Union is useful.
I agree. I fully agree with you. It has strengthened the European Union, and I put some results there that show that after Brexit, the feeling within the European context is stronger for a united Europe than it was before. So it has strengthened. However, we should say that we are very sorry that the British are leaving. And I'm sorry that, and I'm sure that many British are also very sorry that they are leaving. And we are going to lose, and they will lose as well. We would prefer them to stay inside, but if they go, the European Union will continue and will keep strengthening itself.
All right. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much for coming out, especially thanks to our speakers for your insights and your presentations. We'll be hoping to hear from you again soon. Thank you all. Good night.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.